The Glorious Revolution of 1688 was an event in English history that would have echoing effects on the future of the country. When we think of revolutions, we think of opposing sides, mob justice, and a great deal of violence and oppression. The English Revolution was very different in this regard, as it contained almost no violence and a mutual yet uneasy truce between groups of people with different goals and ambitions. The story of the Glorious Revolution centers around various different concepts which are now mainstays in modern Britain. The primacy of Parliament, the rejection of absolute monarchy, and progress towards personal rights were all established due to this very specific event. To understand what led to this break in tradition and the events that transpired, it is necessary to understand England at the time. To understand the events of 1688, it is important to look back a bit farther. England in the 1680s was still reeling from the English Civil War, which had occurred 40 years previous. The country was comprised of three separate kingdoms: England, Scotland to the north, and Ireland to the west. All three kingdoms could be considered separate, with separate political and cultural institutions, but shared a single monarch. The current ruling family were the Stuarts, who inherited the throne when James I, King of Scotland, succeeded Elizabeth I of the Tudor dynasty in 1603. The monarchy was temporarily deposed with the execution of Charles I in 1649 and then restored in 1660 under his son, Charles II. James II, Charles II's brother, would become king in 1685. Religious tolerance was little to be found at this time, with the majority of the country belonging to Anglicanism, Presbyterianism in Scotland, and various dissenting forms from the Church of England such as Puritans and other groups. Most people at the time who were not followers of the Reformation religions were relatively tolerant of each other. However, they did not tolerate Roman Catholicism, which was mostly found in Ireland. The Civil War of the 1640s had given the population a fear of radical beliefs and the oppression that followed, but Catholics still did not possess full religious freedom and civil rights. Successful Stuart monarchs understood this delicate subject and were careful not to upset the order despite having Catholic sympathies. Charles II, who was restored to the throne in 1660, not only had Catholic sympathies but was also sympathetic to France. A long history of competition and wars with the Dutch had warmed public approval of France, who would assist the English with an attack in 1672. France, despite its Catholic population and belief in absolute monarchy, was considered to be far separated from the hated Pope and Roman Catholicism. However, this would be short-lived due to the outcome of the battle. The French land army reportedly owed its tremendous success due to the naval battle between the Dutch and English, which resulted in heavy losses to the English fleet. A series of scandal and rumor followed this, such as the Oates Plot in 1678, where it was claimed that the French were planning to assassinate Charles and place his Catholic brother on the throne. These events, along with anti-French and Catholic sentiments, led to the exclusion crisis of 1679. Charles had failed to produce a legitimate heir, and there was fear among Parliament that his brother James would be next in the line of succession. Parliament forced Charles to pass a series of anti-Catholic legislation and a habeas corpus act in 1679, which would prevent a Catholic king from sending prisoners overseas to avoid English jurisdiction. The most notable bills presented to Parliament were the Exclusion Bills of 1679 and 1680. The bills would effectively remove James from the line of succession. This was an important event in English history, as it created a modern form of political parties between those who supported the exclusion, the Whigs, and those who opposed the exclusion, the Tories. The Whigs could trace their beliefs to the pro-parliamentary Roundheads of the English Civil War. The pro-monarchy Tories had grown from the Cavaliers, the supporters of Charles I. The threat of another civil war was extremely unpopular to the common people. Mobs began to gather in London as Parliament met in Oxford in 1681. The population was primarily on the side of the king due to the oppression caused by the hated Roundheads during the short-lived English Republic. The Whigs begged the king to legitimize one of his Protestant heirs, to which the king refused, citing that he wished to avoid humiliation and a stain on his reputation. The crowds reportedly yelled to let the king live and hang the Roundheads. Charles ruled for another 4 years until his death in 1685, where his brother, James II, became king. James assumed the throne with extremely high popularity and fanfare. Most people welcomed him despite his open Catholicism due to several important factors. He was an older man at 52 and likely to die soon. He had failed to produce an heir that lived past childhood in his new marriage, which left his adult Anglican daughter Mary the presumptive heir. And supporters of the monarchy were pleased that another civil war had been avoided. However, not everyone was happy with this arrangement, as Whig Protestants attempted to overthrow him in June 1685. This attempt was led by the Duke of Monmouth, who gathered an army of 4,000 peasant rebels and farmers. Parliament, concerned with civil war, quickly afforded James an army and money to put down the rebellion. The rebels were slaughtered by 8,000 regular troops at Sedgemoor in July, and the Duke was beheaded shortly after. James' primary goal was to legalize Catholicism through legitimate means before his daughter Mary became queen. He used his support and money from Parliament to begin trying to win MPs over to his side. When he could not charm them, he bullied them. His attempt proved to be ill-timed, as King Louis XIV of France repealed the protections of the 1598 Edict of Nantes, the affirmation of protections and civil rights to Protestants in October of that year. French Catholics joyfully destroyed Protestant churches and cemeteries as 50,000 refugees fled into England with tales of oppression and violence. James acted quickly by dissolving both the Scottish and English parliaments to prevent passing of anti-Catholic legislation. He also used his executive power to exempt Catholics from discrimination. Over the next few years, he began dissolving local-run militias in favor of a standing national army. He appointed Catholics to head this army in all three kingdoms and placed Catholics in control of the English fleet and Tower of London. In Ireland, he instructed his army leaders to recruit Catholic soldiers. By 1686, 67% of regulars and 40% of officers in Ireland were Catholic. James was faced with opposition and discontentment from the Anglican majority. He sought approval from Protestant dissenters by asking for their support in repeal of the Test Acts that ensured only people who took communion from the Church of England within the last 12 months could be publicly elected for office. This would prove beneficial for both dissenters and Catholics. James was unpopular at the time, but did not face open acts of rebellion from Anglicans due to their fear of civil war and royalist traditions. This changed with the events of the summer of 1688. In the summer of 1688, James issued a royal declaration that he would not apply any discriminatory laws against dissenters and Catholics. The Anglican majority could not tolerate this and finally spoke out publicly against James. The Archbishop of Canterbury and several bishops petitioned James to repeal his declaration and accused him of breaking the law. James charged him with libel for suggesting the king was subject to the law. At the same time, a male heir, James Francis Edward, was born to James and his Queen Mary of Modena after 15 years of marriage. 5 of their children at this point had died young, and the new prince was baptized as a Catholic. Anglicans realized that James' Catholic sympathies would not end with his death, as a new male heir took precedence over his Anglican half-sisters born to James' first wife, Anne Hyde. The new prince was scorned by the public, and rumors spread that the baby had been smuggled into the bedchamber in a warming pan. The issue spread beyond England as James' oldest daughter, Princess Mary, aged 26, was married to William III of Orange, stadtholder, and de facto ruler of the Dutch Republic. William was the grandson of Charles I and nephew to James through his older sister, Mary Henrietta Stuart. The Dutch Republic at the time was the leader of the resistance to Louis XIV's France, and war between France and Holland was looming. This was likely to drag the rest of the continent into the conflict. James had invested time and resources into building the naval power of England into the strongest maritime force in Europe. It was unknown which side James would support. James had family ties to the Dutch Republic, but also needed money to support his Catholic revolution in England. In April of 1688, he signed a naval agreement with France, and the Dutch decided that they must stop England from joining a French attack. Anglican resistance in England continued to mount against James. In the summer of 1688, a London jury acquitted several bishops of libel, and 7 government officials, 5 Whigs and 2 Tories, wrote to William of Orange, promising him support if he intervened to secure a free parliament and investigate the authenticity of James' new Catholic son. William was waiting for this assurance and was supported by France's Catholic enemies, the Pope and the King of Spain, on the condition that he not harm British Catholics. The Dutch Republic invaded England in October 1688, while the French were distracted by a conflict between their Turkish allies and the Holy Roman Empire. The seaborne invasion was at first unsuccessful and driven back by the high winds in the English Channel. The second attempt on November 1st was more successful as the Dutch fleet was blown into the Channel, while the same wind kept the English navy stuck in the Thames. 463 Dutch ships landed 5,000 horses, along with 20,000 troops from across Europe at Torbay in southern England. William marched his army to London to face James' army of 53,000. The population of England, fearful of another civil war, began declaring against James. Militias began to meet in the various towns and boroughs of the Midlands and North. They argued that James had become a tyrant who no longer ruled by law and felt this was a necessary defense of English liberty. James had a reported mental breakdown at this news. He sent his wife and son to France, threw the seal of the kingdom into the Thames, and was escorted by the Dutch to the coast where he was able to seek asylum from Louis XIV. James did not try to raise support unlike his father Charles I and left his forces leaderless and unpaid. James would return to Ireland in March 1698 in a failed attempt to regain the throne using a combined French and Irish army. He was defeated by William and an English army at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. James would never return to his former kingdoms and spent the rest of his life in France. Jacobites in England would continue to support him and attempt to assassinate William in 1696, but this plot ultimately failed, which lowered his popularity further. With James in exile, riots ensued across the kingdom, which resulted in Catholic chapels and embassies attacked. Rumors of Irish Catholic troops massacring Protestants fueled this violence, and William was welcomed into London as a savior. New elections were held, and Parliament met in January to discuss and justify what had transpired. It was comprised of 319 Whigs and 232 Tories, which gave the Whigs a majority. The Tories held a majority with the Lords, but both houses were held by moderates. The Whigs, who wanted to oppose the concept of absolute monarchy and limit the power of the crown, felt that James had been deposed after breaking his contract with the people. The Tories, who believed in the God-given right of monarchy and lawful succession, believed James to be incapacitated, with William and Mary acting as regents in his place. Although many Tories would have preferred to keep James on the throne, they realized that his flight had made this impossible and preferred Mary to rule as regent or sole monarch. While Parliament debated the issue, the situation in Ireland began to worsen, and the French had mobilized on the continent in preparation to attack the Dutch Republic. William, becoming impatient, demanded to be made king, and a compromise was reached between opposing sides. William and Mary were made co-sovereigns as William III and Mary II until Mary's death in 1694. William would then rule alone until his death in 1702. The Whig-Tory compromise stated that James had broken his contract between king and people and created a vacancy on the throne through his abdication. His abandonment of the country had destroyed any argument of his lawful continuation, and the Constitution, which James had tried to destroy, was preserved. The Tories were able to pass legislation with Whig support to protect the Anglican establishment against future monarchs, namely the Declaration of Rights. The Declaration undid many of the violations James had committed against the English people and limited the power of the monarchy. Parliament gained the ability to suspend and enact laws, while Protestants were allowed to petition the king without repercussion, allowed to bear arms, allowed to vote freely for representation, allowed freedom of speech, and had protection against unusual punishment and seizure of property unless convicted of a crime. The legislation also banned the creation of any form of Catholic institution. William and Mary agreed to all of these demands and swore to govern according to the statutes of Parliament. The repercussions of the Glorious Revolution were built upon and updated into the current day. The threat of absolute monarchy was ended, and no Catholic king would ever again sit the throne of England. The primacy of Parliament was established and would continue to be a key fixture of the constitutional process. Although Catholics and dissenters did not possess full rights and would not for some time, this was a huge step forward to a fair and more just society.